Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar by the New England Council on Crime and Delinquency, also known as NECCD. My name is Michelle Williams, and I'm the president of NECCD. It is my pleasure to welcome you here today. In today's training, participants will learn to provide resources and referrals, enabling sexual assault survivors to make informed choices. To get us started, please note this webinar is being recorded again. There will be an opportunity for questions and answers at the end. Attendance certificates and training materials and a brief survey will be sent out to all attendees via email. For any licensed social workers who have requested CEUs, please put your name in the chat group with the word CEU so that we may take attendance. Please note, for those individuals, a separate email will be sent out. Again, just to clarify, everyone will get a certificate of attendance, and licensed social workers will receive a CEUs in a separate email. Now, I will introduce today's presenters. The Victim Service Unit consists of 4 victim service specialists and 1 victim service director. The Victim Service Unit out of Vermont provides support and direct service to crime victims and survivors. The Victim Service Unit's primary focus is to provide trauma-informed advocacy and support to individuals who have been impacted by crime. Today we have with us Lucinda Brewer, who's a victim service specialist, Ashley Fix, victim service specialist, coordinator, Megan Place, victim service specialist, and Jenna Santa Maria, victim service director. Not with us today is Danielle Lebec. She is a victim offender specialist. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you for that introduction. Is there anything else from the board before we get started?
You're on cue.
All right.
Over.
Well then, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar training today. I'd like to just get us started by talking a little bit about the how and why of today's content. This training will be about an hour and a half and will cover the topic of responding to sexual assault survivors. We will discuss various options for survivors, including medical resources such as treatment, rape kits, and reporting options. We will also dive into some scenarios. We recognize that this content can be triggering to folks taking this training. And with this in mind, we encourage you all to take care of yourselves, taking breaks, drinking water, and anything else that will make you feel more comfortable whenever you need it. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Lucinda, and I'm the lead trainer for this training and the training coordinator for my team. I created this training with the assistance of all of my colleagues. I came to the DOC as a victim services specialist a little over 2 years ago after working most of my career managing hotlines. In the last 5 years, I began developing trainings because I felt that as someone coming from the perspective of helping survivors both internationally and across the US, on the hotlines, and having listened to what oftentimes felt like the same story with the same barriers for survivors, that I could maybe contribute to meaningful change and to the way that survivors are responded to by the systems that are put in place to assist them. We actually based today's presentation on the Title IX training that I created for university faculty responding to survivors of sexual violence as it was reporting to them. To ensure that they were giving survivors the options and information that they needed. Every Sexual Assault Awareness Month, the DOC Victim Services team also provides a similar training webinar to this to the Vermont DOC staff internally. I'd like you to know that all 5 members of the team added input to this presentation, which was informed from our various diverse backgrounds and perspectives on the work. And I hope that with this, you will find this to be a well-rounded and relevant training. This training is intended to give you the tools to give survivors information and support that they need when they need it to help them make informed and empowered choices. I mentioned that I worked for hotlines for a long time, and I want to tell you all that generally when survivors call hotlines, they not only recount the abuse that they had suffered, but also the lasting impact of the response and care that they received upon coming forward with their assault. Whether they felt supported or blamed, helped or hurt, the response survivors receive becomes a part of their personal narrative as well as the cultural narrative to sexual violence. So in other words, the way that we respond matters a lot. I'd also like to just take a minute to discuss the theme of my unit's Sexual Assault Awareness Month campaign theme, which is dismantling rape culture. We are going to talk a little bit about rape culture and the prevalence of sexual violence in this training, although my feeling is that most of the attendees of this webinar are already aware of the problems. Sexual Assault Awareness Month is not only about visibility for the issues and its survivors, it's a time to self-reflect and commit to change. We have a responsibility to respond to survivors in a way that is trauma responsive, safety focused, and empowering. We hope that this training will give you the tools that you need to be both systemic and personal allies to the survivors that you're serving. The response that we give survivors becomes the response that we are known for as a system. And that impacts the choices that not only survivors will make in the future, but also abusers. And that becomes the culture around sexual violence in their community. And this is why dismantling rape culture is so important. I know that together we can all make an impact. Working with sexual assault survivors is challenging on every level, and I'd like to thank you all for the ways that you show up for survivors every day and the work that you each do. Also, thank you for coming to this presentation. And now, without further ado, I would like you to meet the rest of the wonderful Vermont Department of Corrections Victim Services team. Next slide.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley Fisk. I am a victim service specialist with the Victim Service Unit here at Vermont Department of Corrections. I've been with the DOC for 16 years. The first year I was working for HRD, which was basically hiring correctional officers. And then for the last 15 years, I have been working with victim services or for victim services. As a victim service specialist. And I'm also the VANS coordinator for our unit, which is VANS stands for Vermont Automated Notification Service. And we'll talk more about that in the presentation. And I currently serve Washington, Lamoille, Orleans, Caledonia, and Essex counties in Vermont. Our colleague, Danielle Levesque, who can't be with us today, is a wonderful VSS, and we are so grateful to have her. She has been doing victim service work for 20 plus years. She's a real asset to our team. She currently serves Chittenden, Franklin, and Grand Isle counties.
And hello again, we just met. I am Lucinda, for those of you who just logged on. And I am a victim services specialist and training coordinator for our team. I serve Addison, Rutland, and Bennington counties.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Megan Place. I joined the Vermont Department of Corrections Victim Services Unit in August of 2021, after spending the better part of 14 years working as a victims advocate for the Windsor County State's Attorney's Office. While I spent much of my career working with victim survivors and achieving meaningful outcomes through criminal prosecution, I'm very excited to be lending my experience to center survivor voices in our post-adjudication work. I'm currently serving the southeastern portion of the state, which includes the counties outlined here.
Thanks, Meg. Hello, everyone. My name is Jenna Santamaria, and I am the Victim Services Director. I have been with the Vermont Department of Corrections for about 1 year now. Prior to joining the DOC, I worked in the legal aid setting and the nonprofit world for approximately 10 years, where I provided direct service advocacy to victims and survivors of domestic and sexual violence. This work included court advocacy, grant funding, supervision, and providing trainings about the complexities of gender-based violence to community partners and to other advocates. I've previously worked at the State Appellate Defender Office in Michigan, where I reviewed evidence and drafted recommendations for reconsideration, and served as a court-appointed special advocate where I advocated for at-risk children in juvenile court proceedings. Overall, my professional career has been dedicated to serving survivors of violence, and I look forward to being here today with you. Thank you for your time.
All right, so our first slide, Department of Corrections Victim Services. So this is a list of the services that our unit offers to victims and survivors. So I'm just going to run down it. Information, support and advocacy and referral services, case and incarcerated supervised individual updates and information. So making sure that the victim has the most up-to-date information regarding the incarcerated supervised or the supervised individual in their case. Coordination of state and community-based services. So we work really closely with our community-based counterparts to make sure victims are getting what they need. There's really only so much that we can do in DOC, so we would like to make sure that they are set up moving forward. We provide support before, during, and after parole board and other post-conviction hearings. So this is a big one for us. We attend a lot of parole hearings with victims and survivors. And sometimes a survivor would like to participate without the supervised individual present. So we make arrangements with the parole board. We'll walk the survivor through the process, what it's going to look like, who's going to be attending. And then after the parole board, we'll debrief. We'll let them know, based on the decision, what supervision is going to look like moving forward in the community. And then victim survivor safety planning prior to an incarcerated individual's release from DOC custody. This is also a big one for us. We're constantly working with survivors and our staff when it comes to releasing a supervised individual into the community. We want to make sure that the victims and survivors feel as safe as they can. We want to make sure that they have the resources they need. If there's something we can't provide, we want to make sure that they get it and that they just know they're kept in the loop about what's going on. So that they feel safe and as comfortable as can be. And then, we work with them, throughout the whole process. So while the supervised individual is in our custody, we will continue to work with victims and survivors. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Ashley. So as Lucinda shared previously, we're going to be discussing how to respond to victim survivors of sexual assault. But prior to diving into that material, we wanted to take a moment to review the larger concept of sexual violence. According to RAINN, which is the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, sexual violence is an all-encompassing, non-legal term that refers to crimes like sexual assault, rape, and sexual abuse. It's important to note that the legal definitions may vary from state to state, and that there are often other crimes and forms of violence that arise with crimes like sexual assault. As you can see on the slide, we've listed some examples of sexual violence. One primary example is sexual assault. Sexual assault can happen to anyone, no matter sexual orientation, age, or gender identity. And another example is the sexual assault of people who identify as boys and men. This is distinguished because while men and boys who have been sexually assaulted may often have the same responses or feelings as other survivors, they may face additional challenges because of social attitudes and stereotypes about masculinity. An example of a stereotype that is often heard is that men can't be raped, which we all know is not true. Other examples of sexual violence include intimate partner sexual violence, which is where the perpetrator of sexual violence is the victim survivor's intimate partner. According to the National Coalition on Domestic Violence, women who are sexually abused by an intimate partner report more risk factors for intimate partner homicide than non-sexually abused women. The fourth example listed is child sexual abuse, which is where a legal minor is harmed. Fifth is incest, which is generally defined as a family member who perpetrates unwanted sexual contact with another family member. And the final example is drug-facilitated sexual abuse, which is when alcohol or drugs are used to undermine the person's ability to consent. Drugs and alcohol are often used to make it easier because they affect judgment, may prevent a person from being able to resist, and make it so that some of the details cannot be remembered. So while we're discussing sexual assault and sexual violence, the concept of rape culture is critical, as rape culture helps perpetuate sexual violence. Rape culture is defined as a society or the environment whose prevailing attitudes have the effect of normalizing or trivializing sexual assault and abuse. Rape culture isn't that our society necessarily thinks that rape is good or that we condone raping others. But what we're talking about is how we collectively think about rape. Basically, rape culture is the normalization of sexual assault, and it is so widely accepted that the concept of rape becomes trivial. Rape culture can be seen in obvious examples such as victim blaming and catcalling, but the culture runs much deeper than you may think. Another example could be how people who identify as women often feel less safe walking alone at night than men, or the old saying, which we've all heard, boys will be boys. Another common example is when society supports beloved athletes or celebrities who are charged with rape or other sexual violence and then proceeds to call the victims liars and career destroyers. Most often, rape culture is perpetuated through the use of misogynistic language and the objectification of women's bodies.
Thank you, Jenna. We wanted to take a look at sexual violence prevalence by gender. I'd like to just reference a few different studies that indicate that gender is a risk factor for sexual violence, starting with the study on the left. This circle chart shows us that transgender and non-conforming genderqueer folks are actually at the highest risk for sexual violence on college campuses, meaning that they are at even higher risk than women and men on college campuses. I would like to also point out at the top right report by the Department of Justice that indicates 1 in 6 American women in the United States have been the victim of an attempted or completed rape within their lifetime. You'll also see that a report below from the National Intimate Partner in Sexual Violence Survey from 2015 that indicates that about 2.6% of US men, which is an estimated 2.8 million, experience completed or attempted rape victimization in their lifetime. I should note that this number is suspected to be much higher, but that many men fear coming forward with history of sexual victimization because of the stigma and associated shame that Jenna just touched on. It is also important to note that we speculate that many people of color do not report sexual violence because of negative experiences or perceptions of law enforcement, despite women and transgender people of color to be considered of being at higher risk of being sexually assaulted. Next slide.
Thanks, Lucinda. So now that Lucinda has shared how prevalent sexual violence is, let's talk about how we should be responding to victims and survivors who disclose sexual violence to us. The overarching point to take away is that people who experience sexual violence experience a very profoundly disempowering situation. Knowing that, it's really important that when responding to survivors and their disclosure, that we put them back in the position of being in control of the situation and their choices. This concept is encapsulated in the empowerment-based philosophy, as you can see here on the screen. Some components of this philosophy are listed in blue. The conditions for empowerment include 1, participation in decision-making that affects one's life. 2, the provision of information, skills, and tools necessary to make informed decisions. 3, the creation of a safe and supportive environment for using one's voice. And 4, feeling valued and respected as an individual and having one's choices honored. We all need to make sure that the way we respond to individuals as staff members and collectively as a larger system is trauma responsive to victim survivors. So what this looks like in practice is that when you're responding to a disclosure of sexual violence, you're doing it in such a way that you're putting the victim back in the driver's seat of their own life and experience. We need to be listening, asking open-ended questions, and most importantly, taking their individual needs and goals into account as the conversation progresses. We may be the experts on how certain processes or systems work, but survivors are really the sole experts in their experience. Our role is to simply share our expertise that we have, offer resources and choices, and then support survivors in making their own choices. What we know from the work that we do with victim survivors is that how their initial disclosure is received sets the tone for how they perceive their situation, what resources they subsequently seek out, and ultimately how they heal. So it's really important for all of us as a larger system to get this right.
Thank you, Jenna. Before we go any further, we'd like to just define the role of the person identifying options and navigating resources with survivors. You may hear us refer to this person as a first responder. I would like to differentiate between two definitions for you. The first one being a first responder is someone who is trained or designated to respond in an emergency. The second definition being a sexual assault first responder is someone who supports survivors by providing effective response through resources and adequate information. In the context of this training, we are referring to a person that first responds to the needs of the person that has been assaulted. This could be a probation officer, a hotline advocate, the police, or even a friend. This training is to guide you through the process of responding to a survivor's needs and options, as they are extremely time sensitive, and once safety is established, need to be offered so that the survivor has the ability to make informed and empowered choices. Because in time, many of the choices that we will discuss do disappear. We will also talk about how to be empowerment-based and trauma responsive when delivering this important information to survivors. I'd also like to take this time to clarify that the options around reporting being offered to survivors can only be offered to adult survivors. Mandated reporting obligations that often result in a criminal investigation, of course, still need to be upheld. So to be clear, we're not referring to the role of an interventionist, such as a correctional officer breaking up an assault, or someone who would be taking the report of an assault, although these people can also be sexual assault first responders. This training is strictly about getting survivors the information that they need and in a way that they can hear it before any of the next steps are decided upon. Next slide. So we'd like to talk about some of the medical considerations. Listed here are medical considerations for sexual assault survivors because sexual assault seriously affects health. Keep in mind that most of these options are only available and effective for very small timeframes, which is why giving survivors options as early as possible is critical. I keep this information updated from the SANE, which is Sexual Assault Nurse Examiner, program run by the Vermont Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. It is okay if you don't remember all the information that I'm about to give you. What's most important is that you are able to refer survivors confidently and relay the urgency of early treatment and examination. Meaning, if you don't feel comfortable going over these options with a survivor, know your local resource and ensure that the survivor is connected with someone. Many survivors feel the need to go home, shower, or shut in, and they may do so. But we want to ensure that they realize the options that they have before they dwindle away. We want survivors to be making informed choices and for them to have as many options as possible, even if they do choose to not get treatment. The first option is PEP, also known as, post-exposure prophylaxis. There are different types of prophylactic interventions that can treat different STIs, including HIV and others. These methods are more successful when the medication is taken as early as possible, with a hard cutoff at 72 hours for PEP. The next option is emergency contraceptive, and this is for situations where there's a risk of pregnancy. Again, there's a hard cutoff at 72 hours, and it's most effective when taken as early as possible. Next is assumptive treatment, which can be offered if a survivor believes that they have been exposed to something specific. So, for example, a survivor could be treated specifically for chlamydia. The next consideration is the forensic exam, also known as the rape kit. In Vermont, there is no hard cutoff for the forensic exam. Within 120 hours is optimal. A survivor can choose this option to preserve evidence and decide whether or not they want to report later. And it should also be noted that the window of time that date rape drugs such as GHB can be detected in a person's system through testing is also very small. So this is a very time-sensitive choice that survivors have to get a rape kit that we're going to touch on a little bit further in the next slide. And lastly, a survivor can address other reproductive health needs with a provider. Survivors may have specific concerns relative to their health. And again, we say the earlier, the better for evaluation and possible treatment. Next slide. So now to explain the process of the SANE exam more in depth. The SANE nurse will explain everything to the survivor before the exam begins. The survivor has a right to refuse any part of this exam. The SANE exam will entail very personal examination, which can include very graphic photos, questions, and sample taking. From my experience, forensic exams can take anywhere from 1 to 8 hours. So keep in mind that an exam can be extremely triggering for a person that has just experienced a sexual assault. And so going into the exam with as much information as possible will be helpful in supporting the survivor and feeling empowered and in the know as they decide whether or not this is something that they will embark upon. The exam in its entirety consists of a medical screening exam, treatment as needed for preventative care and for a survivor's injuries, documenting the survivor's account of the assault, a head-to-toe exam looking for injuries and evidence, and a genital exam and forensic evidence collection. Keep in mind that a survivor doesn't need to commit to reporting to the police at the time of the exam. In fact, they are able to store their rape kit anonymously with only a number linking the kit to them that can be retrieved in the event that they decide that they do want to press charges down the line. It should be noted that sexual assault cases with DNA evidence are more likely to move forward with prosecution. The forensic evidence, unfortunately, is lost very quickly, and so a survivor should be made aware that there are many self-care actions that can affect the preservation of this evidence. We've noted some of the activities that I'm referring to include bathing, showering, using the restroom, brushing your teeth, changing clothes, combing hair, cleaning up the area in any way. It should be noted that many times survivors have already washed away evidence by the time of a forensic exam, but it may still be possible to collect other evidence for them and to receive care. Also, remember that often an advocate will be able to accompany a survivor to the exam. So again, it's important to oh, I'm sorry, excuse me. So again, it's important to know your local resources. Next slide.
Thanks, Lucinda. There are also important legal considerations for survivors. Historically, the criminal justice system has not responded to survivors of sexual violence with meaningful or useful remedies for their victimization. The Department of Justice reports that 3 out of 4 sexual assaults go unreported to law enforcement. So knowing that reporting to law enforcement may not feel like an option to some folks, it's important to know what other options exist. One of those options that may be useful for people that you are working with is a protective order. Protection orders are referred to by different titles depending on what jurisdiction you are in and may have slightly differing processes. In Vermont, there are 2 types of protection orders available in our civil justice system. There is the relief from abuse order, also called the RFA, offered through the family court system. And there's also the no sexual assault, no stalking order offered through the superior court system. These orders are similar in the fact that they originate in the civil court system and not the criminal court system. But the failure to comply with the court order restrictions placed on the defendant potentially result in a criminal charge of violation of an abuse prevention order, also known as a VAPO. The first VAPO charge in Vermont is a misdemeanor, but subsequent charges are felonies. RFAs are reserved for people who have been in an intimate relationship, family members, or who have lived together. The no sex assault, no stalking orders are targeted towards individuals who have not been in a relationship with the perpetrator prior to the sexual violence or stalking. One important and very frustrating difference between the RFA and the no sex assault, no stalking order is that in Vermont, the RFA is accessible 24/7 by accessing an after-hours court clerk if the victim wants to apply for an RFA outside of normal court hours. But the no sex assault, no stalking order is only accessible during business hours at the court, Monday through Friday. This is important to know when working with survivors, as the no sex assault, no stalking order has limitations, and we need to understand the relationship between the survivor and the perpetrator so that the survivor can apply for the proper order. The process for obtaining the orders is very similar. The plaintiff applies for a written order detailing the incidents of violence and documenting why they feel like they need the order. A judge reviews the request for a temporary order ex parte, which just means without notice to the defendant, and will either issue a temporary order or deny it. If the order is denied, the survivor has the right to essentially appeal that decision and request a hearing. It's important to know, though, that if a temporary order is initially denied and the defendant then does not know that the victim survivor applied for the order. This is good to know in practice because if the plaintiff wants to go ahead with a hearing, the defendant will be served a copy of the paperwork, which includes the affidavit filed by the plaintiff. This is a practice tip to review with victim survivors when you are working with them. You can safety plan around the defendant finding out about the facts alleged in the affidavit. If the temporary order is granted, there will be a court date scheduled, usually the week after, depending on the court docket schedule, for a final order. The defendant is then served with the temporary order, and both parties appear at the final hearing order, where they each have the opportunity to plead their case and present their side to the judge. The judge makes a ruling using the preponderance of the evidence legal standard. This is the lowest legal threshold to meet and means that the plaintiff must prove that it is more likely than not that the facts presented are true. At the end of the final hearing, the judge will either grant or deny a final order. If granted, the final RFA order will place restrictions on the defendant relating to the plaintiff. Some examples of those restrictions can be to stay a certain distance away from the plaintiff's children, home, workplace, or vehicle, no contact with the plaintiff, or to just allow certain types of contact like telephone or email. It can order the defendant to leave the home temporarily and to grant the plaintiff temporary custody of any children in common with the defendant until a family matter can be filed. An important point that we want to highlight is that we often hear defense attorneys suggest that in lieu of a protective order, the survivor and perpetrator enter into an out-of-court agreement or a mutual restraining order. This can be problematic as the penalties for violation are not a VAPO charge. Victim survivors often do not understand this important difference and see this option as a way to prevent testifying in court. The mutual restraining and out-of-court agreements reinforce dangerous cultural norms, such as that the order restrains both parties from certain behaviors or contact, when the protective order only restrains the defendant, not the survivor. In addition, we frequently hear that a protective order is just a piece of paper. But the reality is that protective order gives law enforcement the power to do something, like arrest the defendant for violating the protective order. Protective orders can be complicated, so it's critical that we are referring victim survivors to the appropriate resources who can support them through this process. And finally, as Lucinda touched on previously, the forensic evidence collection is a time-sensitive process. Though that the option to report to law enforcement after sexual violence is always available to victim survivors. So in practice, if you are working with someone who's on the fence about reporting to law enforcement, it does make sense to get the confidential evidence collection done if the victim survivor is comfortable with this and makes that informed decision. And then the kit will sit at the state crime lab until some point in the future if the victim survivor decides to report, and then the evidence will be accessed as part of the criminal investigation. All right, so this slide I acknowledge is overwhelming. And the slide was added to demonstrate how lengthy and complex state statute can be. 13 VSA 3252 is Vermont's sexual assault statute. There are many statutes that govern sexual assault or sexual violence, but in Vermont, this is the overarching statute that outlines the requirements for a sexual assault charge to be levied against a defendant. As you can see from the slide, there are multiple sections and then subsections. Don't worry, I'm not going to read the slide, as we included it to illustrate the complexities of the law. In order for a prosecutor to bring a sexual assault charge, the requirements of the appropriate section must be met, and the prosecutor has an ethical obligation to believe that all required elements of a crime can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. This is the legal burden that must be met for criminal actions, beyond a reasonable doubt. This is the highest legal burden there is to meet. Now, compare this burden to the burden we just discussed with protective orders, which is the preponderance of the evidence burden. Legal authorities who have attempted to place a numerical value on the two standards have said that the plaintiff may prevail with as little as 51% probability for the preponderance of the evidence burden. But for beyond the reasonable doubt burden, legal authorities place that percentage to 95 to 99% probability. This illustrates the major difference between the two legal standards. At times, this can place the prosecutor in a difficult position when it comes to charging a defendant. If the requirements cannot be met, the charge cannot be brought. In our practice, we have witnessed many times when the prosecutor determines that a charge cannot be brought, and this devastates a survivor and further supports their disbelief in the criminal justice system. Unfortunately, these situations only further marginalize victims. Other barriers that victim survivors face when reporting sexual assault and participating in prosecution also include the low incarceration rates. Sexual assault criminal trials are long, drawn out, physically, emotionally, and can be financially draining. The survivor is forced to retell and relive the assault multiple times and can be aggressively questioned by the defense attorney, their friends and family, jurors, and a judge. Due to the re-victimization, survivors may opt to find their own way to heal outside of a formal criminal justice process, which often fails to protect them. Another barrier for victim survivors is the fear of not being believed. We often hear how many victims lie and just create the story for attention. Unfortunately, some wrongfully assume that a victim survivor is not telling the truth if they did not immediately report the crime to law enforcement, or if they cannot remember certain details of the crime, or speak about the events of the crime in a non-linear way. We know from the work that we do here is that this is common due to the body's trauma response systems, but the misconception about how a victim and survivor should present and report are unfortunately prominent. Again, as we've discussed previously, these held societal beliefs are perpetrated by the predominance of rape culture. In our work, we often hear from victim and survivors that they did not report because they are in fear that they will not be believed. The third barrier that we'll discuss today is that victim survivors may be reluctant to report if they've had a prior relationship with the perpetrator. It is actually a myth that the majority of perpetrators of sexual violence are strangers to the victim survivor. In actuality, the majority of sexual violence survivors know that and have a prior relationship with their perpetrator. According to the National Institute of Justice, approximately 2/3 of sexual assault victims between ages 18 to 29 knew their assailants, and 6 out of every 10 survivors were either acquaintances, friends, relatives, or even in a relationship prior to the assault. So on top of an already daunting and draining criminal justice process, survivors worry about retaliation from their perpetrator, or they struggle with conflicting feelings relating to the perpetrator. In practice, if you are working with a survivor who is struggling with the decision to report, please make sure you are responding using the empowerment-based philosophy to ensure that their experience can be as supported as possible and that you're referring them to the appropriate resources. Our colleague Megan will be reviewing the appropriate resources available to survivors later in the presentation.
So we have covered a lot of territory so far by way of both legal and medical considerations for survivors. To help ensure that you are giving the survivor the information that they may need to make informed choices, I've created a list of questions that you can ask. These questions are designed to help a survivor deciding upon next step understand that they may have further options, but again, that these are time sensitive. The first question is, of course, are you in a safe place? This is especially important if the survivor is calling you and may need an emergency intervention, like they may need you to call 911 on their behalf. Caution should also be taken if the assault was perpetrated by an intimate partner. Of course, you want to ensure that they are not near. The next question is, when did the assault take place? This is important to know as it may limit some options. We want to explain that there are options, but some of them are extremely time sensitive, although a medical provider should evaluate if there are concerns. The next question is, do you need medical attention? The forensic exam will include treatment options and care for injuries, but remember, the survivor can opt for the treatment only and skip the SANE exam if that is what they want to do. There are resources out there that I should say that can help explain the SANE exam. Like for example, at RAIN, which is the Rape, Abuse, and Incest Network, .org, RAINN.org. If you feel that it would be helpful to give the survivor a handout of what to expect during the SANE exam. The next question is specific. Do they want access to STI medication or prophylactics? Remember, this is a time-sensitive option, but that there are more choices early on. Do they want access to emergency contraceptive? Again, time-sensitive, and there are a few different ways that a survivor can obtain Plan B. But remember, it will cost them if they purchase from a pharmacy, and it generally costs around $50, whereas it will likely be covered if it's included in their rape exam. Do they want to report the assault to the police? Many survivors that we work with have already had adverse experiences through the criminal justice system. For example, we work with people who are on supervision and oftentimes have been assaulted. They may fear not being believed, and you offering to help them make a report may help them feel supported while also helping them feel that they are being treated as credible from the start by using your authority and privilege to move forward to the next step with the police. And then lastly, number 7 isn't really a question, it's just an important note to explain the various processes to the best of your ability and ask the survivor if they would like your assistance in setting up next steps. Remember, you are the first person that this survivor has told about the experience, and that may shape the next steps that they decide to take. Next slide.
Thanks, Lucinda. Survivors come to us with vastly differing experiences and backgrounds, but it's important to remember that they come to us with one thing in common. They have trusted you enough to share their experience. While we can never fully prepare for every scenario, we can take some broad strokes towards inclusivity in our conversations that will help every survivor feel heard and supported. Many facets of active listening are things that we do every day in both our professional and personal lives when we are offering support to those individuals we serve and the people that we care about. When working with a survivor of sexual violence, we need to be a bit more intentional in how we implement these skills. While empathizing with a survivor can be a well-intentioned way to show our support, we must remember that every experience is different and the ways in which we heal from trauma can vary greatly. What works for one person may seem counterintuitive to another. It's critical to maintain clear professional boundaries and to refrain from sharing any personal experiences, no matter how similar. Checking in with a survivor about what would make them most comfortable is a simple way that we can recognize the differences and honor choice. It can be as simple as offering seating options, asking whether they prefer the door open or closed, or providing the option to take a break. These simple gestures can provide survivors with a sense of control and empowerment. Follow their conversational cues when it comes to eye contact, body language, pace, and tone. By doing so, you are honoring that they come with a unique set of cultural, individual, and situational needs and reduce any perceived power differential. Our most powerful tool is simply listening. Our everyday conversations typically involve a mutual exchange of ideas and information. It can be difficult to refrain from filling a pause. And while it can feel awkward, a willingness to sit in silence allows the survivor the opportunity to provide an uninterrupted narrative. When you are engaging, ask open-ended questions or statements that offer an opportunity for survivors to share freely. Avoid the why. When it's necessary, check in or clarify. This might include repeating back what you've heard or paraphrasing, saying something like, "What I hear you saying is." As often as necessary, demonstrate compassion, normalize their experience, validate their feelings, and remind them that they are safe. This might sound like saying things like, "Thank you for trusting me with this. I'm so sorry for all that you have been through. I believe you. This is not your fault." It's okay to ask a survivor, what does support look like to you? Survivors of sexual assault, service providers, and allied professionals are not immune to the dangerous narratives that are perpetuated by rape culture. Remind the survivor that they are in no way responsible for the assault. And if you hear self-blaming statements, minimizing or justifying what happened to them, offer a more survivor-centered and compassionate way to talk about and reflect on their experience. But remember that self-blame can be a mechanism for a survivor to maintain a sense of control over what happened. It may be difficult for them to hear you remind them that what happened was not their fault. Most importantly, trust that they are the expert in their own life and honor the decisions that they make, even if it isn't what you would do or doesn't align with your goal to hold the perpetrator accountable. Next slide. Even the most well-intentioned friends, allies, and professionals can inadvertently cause harm in their interactions with survivors. It's an unfortunate illustration of how rape culture has shaped the way that we think and speak about sexual violence. We spent much of this presentation talking about the barriers survivors encounter and the compounding traumatization that can be inherent in the legal and medical responses to sexual violence. Understanding these complexities is crucial when confronting rape culture in our work and implementing strategies to pivot to a more survivor-centered and trauma-informed response to sexual violence. So what does rape culture sound like, and what can we do to reframe these conversations to be more inclusive and survivor-centered? Let's look at these examples here. When sharing their story, a survivor may be met with questions that highlight the listener's disbelief or anger. 1, why didn't you go to the police? While a more trauma-informed response might sound like, I understand that you may have had a lot of reasons for not reporting. How can I support you moving forward? Again, avoid the why. Keep in mind that the challenges of the legal system, and remember that it can be difficult for them to tell anyone, let alone the police. 2, we all know you like them. Didn't you want it to happen? Instead, try saying, I believe you. I'm sorry that they were not the person you thought. It must have been really scary. Keep in mind that the majority of sexual assaults are perpetrated by someone the survivor knows. This may be someone that they trusted, cared about, or even loved. In the very arenas that are tasked with offering safety to survivors and accountability for perpetrators, the experience for survivors is often quite the opposite. 3, they're an A student. It was one night. We can't let this ruin their future. They're from a wholesome family. Instead, say, I'm sorry you were harmed. Oh, I apologize. I apologize. I lost my place. Instead, try, I'm outraged that you were violated. There is no excuse for their actions. I am here to support you. Statements such as this have been infamously known as the Brock-Turner response. Do not align or empathize with an offender when somebody's disclosing to you. 4, I was assaulted and I never acted like this. It's offensive to real victims. Avoid making comparisons to your own experience or the experiences of others you know or have worked with. Acknowledge that every survivor comes to you with their own history and that their trauma response is unique. Instead, try, I'm sorry you were harmed. Everyone responds to trauma differently, and no one way is less valid. And something we hear all too often in our professional settings is, 5, if he assaulted her, why does she want contact again? It's important to understand that there are many reasons why she would want contact with him, and their decision to maintain contact does not invalidate what happened to them. Every case is different. The victim survivor is the expert in their own life. Even when family or friends are trying their best to be supportive, their reactions can be infused with shame, inaccurate suppositions, or may reflect their own value system. 6, I wish you would have told me sooner. You are brave. God wouldn't give you more than you can handle. A more appropriate and supportive and non-judgmental response might sound like, thank you for trusting me to share this story. It sounds like you've been through a lot. I believe you. How can I support you? Next slide. Now, we've mentioned the importance of making appropriate referrals and utilizing our resources. Providing relevant and accurate referrals to survivors is a practical and effective way to support them in making informed choices. The information that you can gather from a simple Google search or a quick phone call can be invaluable to a survivor in crisis. Know your local domestic and sexual violence agencies, where and how survivors can access quality medical treatment, and what legal options and resources are available to them. This should include knowing the contact information, hours of operation, and any limitations on their services. Offer to help survivors identify what next steps make sense for them and to help them connect with those resources. Some regions have special investigations units or designated law enforcement agents with an expertise in investigating sexual violence. Identifying best practices for reporting sexual violence in your region can help dismantle the barriers survivors might encounter if they do decide to pursue a criminal investigation or other legal remedy. You've heard us mention RAINN several times in this presentation. RAINN is the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. It was founded in 1994 and is the nation's largest anti-sexual violence organization. RAINN created and operates the National Sexual Assault Hotline in partnership with more than 1,000 local sexual assault service providers across the country, and operates the Department of Defense Safe Helpline. RAINN also carries out programs to prevent sexual violence, help survivors, and ensure that perpetrators are brought to justice through victim services, public education, public policy, and consulting services. Planned Parenthood. By now, you should all have a sense of how important medical care is after a sexual assault. Survivors can go to their local emergency room, or they may be able to go to the nearest Planned Parenthood health center. Planned Parenthood delivers vital reproductive health care, sex education, and information to millions of people worldwide. Their medical and educational services are widely available throughout the US, and they are available 24/7 to provide free and confidential consulting services. The Polaris Project. Founded in 2002, Polaris is named for the North Star, which people held in slavery in the United States used as a guide to navigate their way to freedom. Polaris serves victims and survivors through the National Human Trafficking Hotline. They work toward building a data set that illuminates how human trafficking really works in real time and are turning knowledge into targeted system-level strategies to disrupt and prevent human trafficking. The Trevor Project. The Trevor Project provides information and support to LGBTQ youth 24/7, 365 days a year. It is the world's largest suicide prevention and crisis intervention organization for LGBTQ young people. The Trevor Project offers ever-expanding digital crisis services, including Trevor Lifeline, Trevor Text, and Trevor Chat. Additionally, the project works with policymakers to pass legislation protecting young LGBTQ people. The Hotline, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, the National Domestic Violence Hotline provides essential tools and support to help survivors of domestic violence so they can live their lives free from abuse. Contacts to the hotline can expect highly trained, expert advocates to offer free, confidential, and compassionate support, crisis intervention information, education, and referral services in over 200 languages. Women's Law. The National Women's Law Center fights for gender justice in the courts, in policy, and in our society, working across the issues that are central to the lives of women and girls. They use the law in all of its forms to change culture and drive solutions to the gender inequity that shapes our society and to break down the barriers that harm all of us, especially women of color, LGBTQ people, and low-income women and families. For nearly 50 years, women's law has been on the leading edge of every major legal and policy victory for women. The National Center for Victims of Crime. The National Center for Victims of Crime is a nonprofit organization that advocates for victims' rights, trains professionals who work with victims, and serves as a trusted source of information on victims' issues. After more than 35 years, the National Center remains the most comprehensive national resource committed to advancing victims' rights and helping victims of crime rebuild their lives. The National Center is, at its core, an advocacy organization committed to and working on behalf of crime victims and their families. Rather than focusing the entire organization's work on one type of crime or victimization, the National Center addresses all types of crimes. And finally, the State Department of Corrections Victim Services Unit or equivalent, which is us, who you've met today in Vermont. If you're working with a survivor in a post-adjudication setting, or if the perpetrator is incarcerated or on supervision, be sure to know who your DOC victim service providers are in your state or area. For your convenience, we will provide the contact information for the New England providers in the chat box here. And now I'll turn it over to Ashley to discuss VANS and VineLink.
Thank you, Megan. So as I said in the beginning, I am the VANS coordinator for our unit, which stands for Vermont Automated Notification Service. And this is sponsored by VINE, which stands for Victim Information Notification Every Day. And this service is offered in all states, but I think that there's only a couple that don't actually use it. And this is a great resource for victims. So there's a front end and a back end. The front end is VineLink. And this is where survivors and victims and survivors can go ahead and search for an offender by state, and they can register to receive notification on the offender in their case. So they'll be kept up to date with parole hearings, when somebody's transferred in and out of a facility, and that kind of thing. And so that's open to the public. In Vermont, we have an open system. I think in other states, you do have to be the direct victim to register, but it's still a wonderful service, a wonderful resource for victims and survivors. The back end is VineWatch, and that is where you can see who is registered for the supervised individual, how they're registered by phone, email, text message, what kind of notifications they've gotten. So all around, this is a great resource for everybody involved. And we strongly suggest that survivors get registered to receive this notification. Next slide. Okay, so we're gonna do, we had a couple case examples. So we ask that you guys please put your answers in the chat box. The first example is Beck. Beck was sexually assaulted by an acquaintance, is on supervision and is wary of reporting and any law enforcement involvement, is concerned about STIs. The assault occurred 2 days ago. Beck identifies as a non-binary individual and is concerned about seeking medical treatment because of their gender. How would you provide options and resources to Beck that are empowerment-based and inclusive? And so we'll give you guys a couple minutes to put your answers in the chat. I'm not seeing anything, so we're going to give you guys a little bit more time.
Would people feel more comfortable coming off mute and keeping their cameras off to answer the question?
That is more complicated, unfortunately,
Okay.
to be able to do. I'm actually putting a response myself in here. If anyone else would like to participate, if someone would like to come off mute, you're welcome to raise your hand and I can add you to the panel.
All right, we'll give it a couple more before we go ahead and do some brainstorming together as a larger group. Thanks, Amy.
Okay, so we have allow Beck to set up reporting as they are comfortable from the beginning. Yeah, and I mean, I think that everyone pretty much gets it. You know, provide them the resources that we've talked about. We have another one. Thanks for sharing your experience with me. I hear your concerns about seeking medical help. Would a specific med provider be more helpful? Yes, exactly. This is exactly what we're talking about. So for, you know, just providing them what they need, what we've talked about in the previous slides. We have another one, ask them if they want access to contact info for medical providers and options. Yep, great.
Perfect. And because we know from the fact pattern that Beck identifies as a non-binary individual, you could also refer them to the Trevor Project. Megan touched on in the resources slide. You also could talk about the SANE exam and refer them to the appropriate medical providers, which you all have named. So that's excellent work.
Great job. Thank you, guys. Next example.
Hey, everybody. Case example is Stella. Again, we'll ask you to please put your answers in the chat box since it seems a little complicated to raise your hand and come off mute. Here's the fact pattern for Stella. Stella was sexually assaulted by a stranger. Stella's support person, her mother, is very vocal and would like to be involved. Stella does not want to file a police report. Stella wants all of the medical treatment available, including for injuries she sustains, and the assault occurred 10 hours ago. How will you provide options and resources to Stella that are empowerment-based and inclusive? And again, we'll just give you a couple minutes to share some ideas in the chat box. I would also be interested, I know people are from around New England, so if you have local resources that would be appropriate, please feel free to share them here. Don't jump all at once, everybody. Slow it down. I think that we can, if it's more comfortable, we can just go ahead and brainstorm. But yes, offer to accompany her to her local emergency room, call ahead and request the presence of a sexual assault trained nurse or doctor. Yes, SANE nurses are wonderful. Oh, see, now you guys are really like showing me up because I can't even keep up with the chat box now. Ask how Stella feels regarding mom being involved. Excellent point. Yes, thank you, Lauren. Ask her choice for medical treatment. I would still give information on police reports just in case she decides to change her mind later on when she processes it. Yes, recommend a SANE where it's a safe place to get tested and have all the health issues looked at. Amazing. Thank you, Yasmin. Hey, Stella's mom, thanks for being such a great advocate for Stella. I'm going to ask that you bear with me while I explain the options to Stella, and Stella can choose what she would like to do. Yeah, that's an excellent point. Even asking, I think it's an excellent suggestion to ask to speak with Stella privately, or if Stella would like to speak with you privately. Oftentimes when the moms come in and they're a little bit overbearing, I might say that it's standard practice for us to speak with the survivor alone. I understand you not wanting to file a police report at this time. Would you be comfortable doing an exam in case you change your mind in the future? Yes, important. I think Lucinda touched on this quite a lot in the medical portion, but just impressing upon them that they can do the evidence collection piece, explaining what that might look like, but that it could be accessed at a later date is important. Here in Connecticut, we have Safe Haven and Susan B. Anthony projects explain options and why supports are important. Yes, awesome, Caroline. Thank you so much, everybody. To the other panelists, are there any other things that we didn't cover in the chat? I was a little involved with reading all these great responses. So if we missed anything, please chime in, but all of these were excellent options and resources. So thanks, everybody.
And our last example is Brent. So Brent is on supervision for a sex crime. Brent was assaulted shortly after being released from jail into the community. Brent is requesting medical treatment, is undecided about reporting to law enforcement, and says the assault occurred 12 hours ago. So again, how would you provide options and resources that are empowerment-based and inclusive? So this is a little bit of a different one because Brent is on supervision for a sex crime. So I think it's important to acknowledge that, you know, even though he's on supervision, that you do believe him and that his feelings are valid and what he went through. You know, we're sorry about what he went through and what he's endured. Let's see, request medical treatment. So setting him up with the proper medical services, you know, the same kit, getting a sane nurse. Let's see, thanks for sharing, Brent. Let's go ahead and get you to medical supports. You don't have to decide about reporting to law enforcement just yet. Let's get you where you need to go right now. That's perfect. And that's it. That's great. I think you guys get the gist of it. And thank you for your answers.
All right, everyone. Well, this concludes the presentation portion today. You can see our unit's contact information on the slide. We do have an alias email. So if any other questions or comments pop up, please feel free to email us or to call our number that's listed here too. But now we want to open it up to the group. Are there any questions that you may have that we can answer for you today? Okay.
And we can ask folks to either use the chat box or the Q&A box, or if you would like to speak up, you can raise your hand and we can add you to the panel.
Okay, I'm seeing a message in the chat box. Thank you, Herb. I am just reading it now. If I'm not mistaken, NOVA, the National Organization for Victim Assistance, a nonprofit, was not on the list you provided. Do you also work with NOVA around sexual assault related cases, issues, resources, and programs? I've attended some trainings by them and they are great. I can open this up to our team. I can say personally, I have not worked with NOVA, but I'm writing that down because I will certainly look into it. I don't know if anyone else from the team has worked with them.
I have not. This is Ashley. And Herb, I just want to say hi. I have not personally worked with them either, but we can certainly look into that. There was a question around children. For children, would you use a similar approach as the examples?
Well, for children, that does open up another set of more complicated factors because of mandated reporting. I think when working with children, victim survivors, and again, the team, please chime in. I would just take a very, supportive approach, stay factual. I personally would use a similar approach. I would probably change maybe some of my terminology a little bit so it was age appropriate.
Yes.
But definitely using like the correct anatomy terms would be crucial, and just making sure that you're supportive, but also knowing that you know what the mandating laws are in your jurisdiction and knowing what the rights are of parents as well, especially, well, if they're not the perpetrators. So it's just important to know those dynamics.
I agree.
As far as making kids aware of what the next steps are, that's more or less the same, just being as transparent as you can possibly be and making sure that the kids are prepared for the next things that they're going to experience. In particular, the questions that they're going to be asked. You want to let them know that the system will ask them questions, you know, that the next few steps will they're going to be examined in many levels. And at times it may feel like people don't believe what you're saying. And to just remind them that this is a part of the process and that it's not personal to them. I think kids feel better moving forward, knowing that this is something that it hasn't only happened to them, that they're not alone, but also that the system is hard. The process of examining a sexual assault child victim is difficult, but that they should be truthful and feel confident in moving forward, knowing that this is what it looks like. It's not just happening this way because someone doesn't believe what they're saying.
That's a good point, Lou.
Yeah, I would also just note that because of mandated reporting laws and like depending on the age of the child, you know, if we're talking about youth, it can look quite similar to the examples that we gave. But if we're talking about young children, obviously, as Jenna said, age appropriate information and a frank conversation with the non-offending family member or guardian about who is going to get involved at that point. Because typically there would be the Department of Children and Families or equivalent for your state. And oftentimes, as I noted in the resource slide, you know, certain areas have special investigations unit, but various regions also have particular like units dedicated to children, and the forensic interviewing process of children looks much differently. And there's a lot less control for children and families about how it moves forward because of mandating reported laws. So just to something to keep in mind.
That's a great point, Megan. Thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you.
Oh, their target population is
Yeah.
elementary. Oh, that's a tough, that's
Yeah.
a tough population to work with.
Yeah, I would definitely some of the information I just shared, Yasmin, would be relevant to
Yeah.
that population because those kids are quite young, obviously, once we get toward third, fourth, fifth grade. But again, the forensic interviewing process is quite different for young kids. And the involvement of your Department of Children and Families, as well as reports to law enforcement. So I think just being as transparent as possible with what is going to happen and making sure that you understand what is going to be shared and with who is very important.
And thank you for the work you do, Yasmin. All of you guys that have participated, thank you so much.
Thank you, Paula.
Thanks, Paula.
All right, well, if there are no further questions, I will stop sharing my screen. But again, feel free to reach out to us via email or phone. We're here and we're available as a resource to you all.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much to our presenters today. If you are a licensed social worker, please remember to put your name in the chat box below before we wrap up so that we can send you the CEUs. We'd also like to thank the amazing folks at NACCD who worked to make this training happen. Please take a moment to complete the brief survey that will be emailed out along with your certificates and let us know how you're doing. I would also like to encourage you to check out our website, neccd.net, and sign up to become a member of the New England Council on Crime and Delinquency. Our members get full access to amazing trainings, conferences, networking opportunities, as well as scholarship opportunities and discounted tuition at the Southern New Hampshire University. You can also follow us on Facebook. Thank you so much for attending today. Please be on the lookout for our next series in 2022. We hope you you have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for our presenters today.
Thank you, guys.
Goodbye.